Hi, I'm Rachel, and if you've never seen me before, welcome. And if you have been to my channel before, welcome back. You guys, I've been spending so much time researching this video. It's unbelievable. The makeup and true crime niche has been really exploding lately, and I'm into it. I love it. I love all of them. But it also got me thinking that, yeah, like a true crime get ready with me, that's fun. And I definitely listen to true crime stuff and watch videos while I'm getting ready for the day. But most of the time, I watch them to relax. After a hard day of doing whatever it is I'm doing, I like to kick back, maybe do a face mask, little skincare nighttime routine, get ready for bed, settle in with my nighttime cup of coffee, which doesn't affect my sleep at all, and watch some true crime stuff. So that's what we're doing today. It's sort of true crime and self-care. So this evening, get unready with me. I'm gonna take off my makeup. We're gonna do some skincare. So I hope you'll grab some coffee or tea or whatever it is that you drink in the evening, and grab a little sheet mask or maybe just soak your feet. And I'm going to tell you the true crime story of a young boy from a small town in Indiana whose dreams of excitement and fame led him to become the ringleader of a New York City counterculture movement. These so-called club kids transformed New York nightlife until 1997, when Micheal Alig, the boy in question, the so-called king of the club kids, was arrested for the murder and dismemberment of Andre Angel Melendez. To really grasp the full breadth of this story and how something like this could happen, we need to do a lot of background, because this happened in a very specific time and place, and I feel like I really need to help you understand the character of Micheal Alig so you can understand how he ended up doing what he did. I hate to do this to you on my very first true crime video, but it is going to be a two-parter. This is going to be a little bit of a deeper dive. So I know that was a lot of lead up. Really quick, I do just need to give a little bit of a disclaimer. First of all, this is a true crime story. There are criminal events discussed, including, in this story, discussions of substance use and also violence. As such, it is intended for persons age 18 and older, so hide your kids. Secondly, I do not intend any disrespect in anything that I say to any persons living or dead. No disrespect at all. Furthermore, all opinions are just that. They are opinions. They are my own, and they are not to be taken as statements of fact. Now that we've finally got all that out of the way, let's get into the murder of Angel Melendez. Okay, Micheal Alig was born to Elka and John Alig in South Bend, Indiana in 1966, April 29th. To be exact, he's a Taurus, just like me, and also from Indiana, just like me. We already have too much in common. His parents did divorce when he was 4 years old, and after that, his dad really just didn't have a lot to do with him. I couldn't find that much information. His dad has never since given an interview or anything like that. I don't know anything about him, and I'm sorry for that, but it just sort of seems like after he and Elka split up, he just wasn't really a part of Michael's life, which you hate to hear, you know? Unless he was maybe better off without him. I don't know. I probably shouldn't assume. All reports from Micheal and people who knew him say that he had sort of an unhappy childhood, you know? He had a single mom, and they were apparently pretty poor. They didn't have a lot of money. On top of that, Micheal was pretty smart and kind of weird. I don't know how weird he actually was. I think that he was really flamboyant and effeminate. He was gay, and this was not very popular. It's still not that popular in Indiana. Honestly, I can tell you from living here, it's still not that gay friendly. But at the time, in the 60s and 70s, when he was like a kid and growing up, forget about it. He was bullied by his classmates, just did not get on very well. I think he always, like a lot of kids in his position, just had the feeling that it was hard for him to belong. So, you know, I think that some of us can relate to that, just kind of feeling outcast. But again, because he was gay, and he was openly gay, you know, his mom would later say she didn't know he was gay until after he went to college, but apparently she was the only one that didn't know, because to everyone else it was pretty obvious. I mentioned He was smart, and you're like, Rachel, how smart was he? He was a straight A student, okay? Straight A student. And he actually graduated in the top 8% of his high school class. So you tell me. Sounds like a smart cookie. I couldn't do that. Top 8%, we're talking like, I don't know if he was like the valedictorian, but he was up there. But because he was bullied and felt very different and outcast, he really just couldn't wait to get out of Indiana, which is really, really common for people from Indiana. Most people aren't like, yay, Indiana, so understandable. And luckily for him, because he was such a smarty pants, he landed a scholarship to Fordham College in New York City. So Michael's thinking this is going to be perfect because he'll just be able to be more himself out in New York City. You know, it's the East Coast. It's a little more accepting, a little more liberal, and he's into it. So in 1984, he does just that. He catches a bus or a plane, or I don't know how he got there, but the point is in 1984, he arrives in New York City ready to build a little life for himself. Now I'm going to pause on Michael. We're just gonna leave him right there at the plane or train or bus station or whatever it was, because I need to introduce a new person to this story. We cannot talk about Michael Alig without also talking about James St. James. James St. James was born James Clark. And he was also born in 1966, August 1st, to an affluent family in Saginaw, Michigan. Affluent means loaded, okay? They were rich. James St. James's parents also divorced when he was a kid, and from that point on, he spent time between his mom's house in Michigan and his dad's house, and he had moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. James St. James was also openly gay. He was also very flamboyant. He was interested in the arts and acting. And he also, like Michael, was bullied in school and always felt outcast and different. Of course, he also had a bunch of money. And I'm not saying that money solves all your problems, but it can definitely take the sting out of things. The point is he had more options open to him than Michael did. So he also went to New York City in 1984 after finishing high school. And he was going to attend New York University. I want to drop in right now that after the events of this story, James St. James, who was sort of Michael's best friend while they were in New York after they met, we would probably describe them more as frenemies. That's what I get from the relationship. But anyway, James St. James would go on after all of this happened to write a book called Disco Bloodbath, which is a memoir of his time in the club scene with Michael and also of the murder. But of course, it's written from James's perspective. This book was released in 1998, just a year after Michael's arrest. In 2003, it would be turned into a major motion picture starring Macaulay Culkin and Seth Green, and they called that movie Party Monster. After that, the name of James's book was also changed to Party Monster because the movie, even though it's kind of a cult classic, the movie was more popular. And I'm a little embarrassed to admit that although I saw this movie during my coming of age, you know, as a teenager, older teenager, I did not read the book until I started researching this story. And I'm gonna leave that there for now because we are going to talk more about the book and the movie and how they influenced public perception of the crime, but we're gonna talk about that in part 2. So now we've met Michael Alig and we've met James St. James, and they've both arrived in New York in 1984, but of course they don't know each other yet. Now let me paint a picture for you. The New York City that Michael and James arrived to in the mid-80s is vastly different than the New York City that we know today. This is my first time using this face mask and it smells so good. Anyway, in 1984, Giuliani had not been elected the mayor of New York yet and come in with his Gestapo cleaning up the streets, cutting down on crime, and just generally ruining everybody's good time. In fact, at this time, New York was one of the most dangerous cities in the entire country. And there's multiple reasons for this, but one of the major reasons is that they had had huge problems with mismanagement of the city's money. And this led to the city being nearly bankrupt by the early 90s. And what does it mean when a city goes bankrupt? Well, it means that they can't pay for public goods and services, like beautification projects for the city that make people happy. They can't do things like put money into public transportation. And for this reason, the subway at this time, which is what many, many millions of New Yorkers used to get around everywhere, was filthy. Like hepatitis levels of filth and covered in graffiti because the city didn't have any money to fix it up or take care of that problem. There were also not very many cops because cops get paid by the city and they didn't have any money to pay the cops, so they didn't have very many cops. So it's not that there was like nobody enforcing the rules, but they had their priorities and they had to prioritize stuff. So some of the smaller stuff like petty theft and things like that just maybe slid under the radar a little more than they would have had the city not been totally busted. Oh, and Times Square, which of course we know as like the very, oh my God, it's dripping everywhere. It's on my mouth. Times Square, which we know as being sort of the center of the New York tourist trade. You know, it's got all the big LED lights. There's huge billboards everywhere. I don't know, just everything going on. You know what Times Square is. I don't need to go on about this, but Times Square at this time, nobody went there. It was not a tourist destination. If you were a tourist to New York, you probably avoided Times Square because it was nothing but adult movie theaters. They used to have those. You didn't just like, there wasn't the internet, so you could just pull that stuff up on your computer screen. No, you went to a movie theater with a bunch of other people to watch your adult content films. And that's all that was on Times Square. There were lots of homeless people. I mean, there was homelessness rampant in the entire city, but especially on Times Square. And of course, sex workers. Lots and lots of them. In a later interview, Micheal Alig would remark that sometimes he and his little club kids, his little band of weirdos, would be the only ones in Times Square after dark. It was sort of like renegade to go hang out in Times Square. Obviously, that's not the way that it is anymore. The one good thing about New York City being such a cesspit is that rent was a lot cheaper than it is now. It was still pretty expensive because it was still a big city. So it was expensive compared to like other places in the country, but compared to what New York is now, rent was pretty inexpensive. And because of that, you had a thriving culture of artists and performers and things like that, because they could go and they could work on their art and not have to worry about, paying $3,000 a month in rent. And it just gave them more time to work on their craft, etc. So you had like in Greenwich Village and Soho, just full of these like artistic hippie types mostly. And it was a really unique part of New York City that some people today really lament has kind of been lost now that all this money came into New York and you can't afford to live there anymore. I'm gonna talk at you a while I let this mask dry. Isn't it pretty? So there's no money for shelters. There's no money for drug programs. There's no money for cops. There's no money for any kind of public works. And because of that, New York City is very dangerous, but a little cheaper than it is now. Some people said that it was considered a city beyond hope. Most importantly to this story is that it was a very weird time for nightlife in the Big Apple. Disco was dead. Studio 54 was winding down. It was not the club that it used to be in its heyday, and it would eventually, in 1986, just close altogether. And this left a little bit of a void. Disco was out, but nothing else had really moved in. So you had these sort of underground clubs. There were like warehouses where there would be these like pop-up parties and things like that. And there were proper clubs sort of popping up around the city. And before too long, the city was full of them. But they would play like live music, they would show films sometimes, and they generally were sort of catering to like the art scene. Remember, there was sort of a thriving art scene. So they were kind of catering to the art scene rather than like the clubbing scene. And all of the really cool people, the who's who of clubbing and nightlife in New York City, were with Andy Warhol in the Factory. Andy Warhol was an artist. If you don't know that, you should look him up. He's very influential, very iconic artist who lived in New York. And the Factory was sort of, it was his, like a private residence, but it was like his art studio. And he would invite all these people over to party. These were fellow artists, musicians, actual celebrities like you know, David Bowie was somebody who would hang out at the factory. Liza Minnelli was really big there. And he just sort of surrounded himself with like interesting people. He called him his superstars. And a lot of times these people were considered sort of weirdos and freaks. A lot of them would be part of the LGBTQ plus community. They didn't call it that back then. They said somebody was a cross-dresser or gay or whatever. But a lot of that going on, which would have set them apart. Not so much in New York, but like set them apart from like other places, I guess. So we can see with this thriving art scene and sort of this LGBT friendly environment might be attractive to a couple of gay kids from middle America who just really didn't feel like they fit in. This seemed to them like a place where they could go, express themselves freely, they could find acceptance, and possibly even be celebrated for the flamboyance and creativity that had gotten them ridiculed throughout their entire lives. Whew, this takes a long time to dry. And before we move on, I need you to understand one thing about the New York club scene. It really revolved around this sort of old school elite hierarchy. So you had like Andy Warhol and his whole crew were definitely like at the top of this. Like if you hung out with Andy Warhol or you got invited to the factory, you were really cool. And then you had sort of like actual celebrities. And let's be fair, if you were an actual celebrity, Andy Warhol probably wanted to hang out with you. And I'm sorry I keep bringing up Andy Warhol so much, but it's important to understand his whole thing because Micheal and James were both incredibly inspired by Warhol and sort of what he did. His art, to a certain extent, yes, but beyond his art, they were very inspired by the way that he cultivated celebrity and could bring people in and make them famous just by their association with him. So that's one of the reasons that we're having such a Warhol heavy moment here. This hierarchy, Andy Warhol and his crew, definitely you're at the top. Then you have like actual real celebrities. And then you have something that they dubbed celebutantes, which these are kids, mostly younger people, who are famous just for nothing. We're talking about maybe like Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie would probably be the last like most famous celebutantes that we would think of. They're just wealthy, they've got trust funds, they go out and spend a lot of money, and their whole deal is just to sort of be seen going out to all the expensive clubs and the hottest nighttime places, and that's all they do. So they're not like real celebrities, but they call them celebutantes. These are sliding down my face. James ended up only going to New York University for a couple of years. Remember that he himself was sort of a trust fund baby. His family had a lot of money. So he decided that he'd much rather be out in the clubs, being seen, having fun, and rubbing elbows with all of the fancy people. So he kind of gets in and he starts working his way up into this hierarchy. Now, of course, when these are sliding down my whole face, these have to go. So he's paying his dues. He's talking to all the right people. He is actually putting in a lot of effort to this. He's not just going out, like he's deciding who are the important people to talk to. What is the right thing to wear? He's got all his designer labels. He's going to all the hot it places. And through doing this, he did gain some notoriety and was eventually dubbed a celebutante himself, which you may think is a weird title for a man, but you have to remember that James's whole deal, he would usually wear like women's clothing and things like that. One of his signature things was to carry around a lunchbox as like a bag. So instead of wearing a purse, he would carry some kind of old-fashioned like tin lunchbox with like a latch. And this became later on down the line with the club kids and Micheal Alig, this became a very signature thing. Some club owners who didn't want the club kids in their club said that it got to the point that the doormen would just, anybody who was carrying a lunchbox, they just wouldn't let them in because they knew they were going to be trouble. Isn't that fabulous? So you've got James and he's doing his celebutante thing, working within this already existing hierarchy. Now Micheal also only spent a couple of years at college, and he also was more drawn to this idea of being part of this elite clubbing thing. But he did not have the same financial advantages that James had. So he couldn't go out and buy the Chanel and the Gucci and the whatever it was that was popular at that time. He couldn't afford to shell out a bunch of money to go to these expensive clubs and buy bottle service and, you know, whatever it is, again, that they did. You know, he also didn't have the trust fund so that he could, you know, just not work and focus all of his time on being part of this nightlife and then just have his apartment paid for and food paid for and all of that. So he took a job, and he took a job as a busboy at a club called Danceteria. And this was a really popular club, and it was frequented by James and the people that he hung out with. But you know, Micheal did not move to New York City to pick up the dirty glasses of fabulous people. He wanted to be a fabulous person. And so he starts buzzing around James and his friends when they come in. I'm not sure exactly what drew him to James specifically. I assume it's because they were the same age, and maybe he thought he would be a good in, because although he had been dubbed a celebutante and he knew all the right people and he knew how to do all the right things, he wasn't really elevated to an untouchable status. So maybe, you know, Micheal just saw somebody his own age who he thought was approachable. They also had sort of a similar background. I don't know how he would have found that out, but for whatever reason, Micheal starts working on James, and he's buzzing around him and his friends. And you know those people who are just constantly there and you're not really friends with them, but you don't really like have the heart to tell them to F off. And they're a little bit too familiar, I think is what I'm looking for. They're just act a little more familiar than would be right, because you don't really know them that well. And this was Micheal. This was Micheal with James. And James actually found him pretty obnoxious and really didn't want to have anything to do with him. He kind of thought he was like, who is this kid who is just coming in here and acting like he knows us, you know, trying to give us all these ideas for parties and stuff like who is this kid? So James didn't really pay him that much mind. But Micheal had this boyfriend named Keoki. That's not his real name, but that's what they called him. He would later become superstar DJ Keoki. DJ Keoki is still a DJ today. He still plays. And if you're really into like electronic dance music and you're pretty old school on that, you may even know who he is. He was really in early on the EDM scene. So Keoki was always around, and this is sort of why James tolerated Micheal. This is what he, you know, says later on, is that he had a huge crush on James had a huge crush on Keoki, and he always wanted to be around Keoki because he was this cute kid. He just really was in love with him, and so he would tolerate Micheal being around, because when Micheal was around, Keoki was around. This is just sort of an aside. Knowing more about Michael's personality as he got older and what he did, I don't know how his feelings for Keoki were, but I have a feeling that he wanted to be with Keoki because, first of all, Michael's the only man to this day, the only man that Keoki admits to having been with. Keoki would say he was out clubbing and looking for girls, and that's when he met Micheal, and they ended up making out behind a dumpster. Like, that's the kind of draw, I would call it superficial charm, that Micheal had on people. There's this 18, 19-year-old kid, never been interested in a man a day in his life, and in the span of one night, he's making out with Micheal behind the dumpster in an alleyway. And I can't ever know what Michael's feelings for Keoki were, but I imagine that Micheal noticed that James was interested in Keoki, and that is one of the reasons that Keoki was around so much. He was useful to Micheal because not only did it draw interest, because here's this guy with this really cute guy on his arm following him around like a little puppy, but James specifically was interested in Keoki. And I think that's really important to note about Micheal and Keoki's relationship. I've said Keoki about 800 times. I'm so sorry if that's annoying. So I thought this was a peel-off mask, and it is not. It's a wash-off mask. How fun for me. So Micheal does sort of get an in with this club owner. His name's Rudolph, and for some reason, he sort of takes a liking to Micheal. Rudolph was a German immigrant, and Michael's mother was also a German immigrant, and this is absolute pure conjecture, But sometimes when you find out you've got something like in common with somebody, for instance, a similar country of origin, it can build a familiarity that can make you like somebody or trust somebody a little more. I have no idea for sure, but I assume that that might have been going on. A little element of that may have been happening between Rudolph and Micheal. And so Rudolph starts letting Micheal promote parties. You see, unlike James, who wanted to just exist in the limelight, Micheal really wanted to be a club promoter. He didn't want to just go to the parties. He wanted to make the parties. And remember, I'm going to bring this up several times, but Micheal is smart, okay? And this is a really smart move on Michael's part, because that's where the real power is. And I think that that's what Micheal was looking for. He was looking to exert influence over people. He wanted to feel like people liked him. He wanted to feel like he was a central, important figure in the lives of people who he didn't even know. These party promoters could become very popular very quickly, and they would be your in. You were cozied up to a party promoter, and you got to be in all the hottest parties in the city, which is what everybody wanted. And while Micheal is promoting these parties for Rudolph and his businesses, his clubs, Rudolph's showing him the ropes a little bit, giving him a little bit of an idea of what it takes to run a club and promote a club, and sort of the business side of things a little bit. So the cool thing about Micheal's parties that he would throw is that he was really breaking convention, because you know how it is when you go out, you dress to the nines, you want to look your absolute best, especially around this scene. You wanted to show off your wealth. You wanted to show off how much you had. You wanted to wear all the good designers and, you know, sort of high fashion kind of stuff. Micheal, he wasn't into that. He wanted to do something a little new and a little different. So he would do things like wear polka dots on his face, like paint his face with polka dots, or find people who were nobody. I mean, everybody's lavishing praise on, you know, the big names and the artists and the celebrities, and that's who everybody wants at their parties. But he would just take like some drag queen that no one had ever heard of before, would act like they were like the best thing ever, and would give them so much attention and tell everybody how great they were and all of this, and sort of maybe even ignore anybody who was really would feel that they deserved that status. Almost backwards in a way. But I guess a lot of people found it refreshing or different or new. Sort of this anti-fashion. Instead of high fashion, it was like anti-fashion, weird outfits and strange makeup and whatever. And he was really kind of genius in doing this. He realized that because of his background, he would really never be accepted by these elite club goers. He didn't have the money to be a celebutante like James did, and he didn't have the artistic renown to get an invite to the factory and Andy Warhol's inner circle. But what he did have, in abundance, was an overwhelming personality, and also this big old brain that he was putting to pretty good use for his own purposes. Remember how I talked about how nightlife was sort of weird at this time? Well, Micheal kind of locked into that. He realized that the old club scene was dying. The climate was changing and people were looking for something else and something different. I just want to mention, these eye patches are burning me under my eyes. But anyway, he really wanted to sort of be the one to bring new life into the New York City night scene. So instead of trying to fit in where he wasn't wanted, he was gonna sort of create a world unto himself. And he would become what people wanted and who they wanted to be with. And then in 1987, Andy Warhol died suddenly. It was really unexpected. I think he was only like in his late 50s. So it was really shocking for people. The Village Voice printed an article called The Death of Downtown when Andy Warhol died. They just didn't see New York City nightlife as being able to go on without Andy Warhol. He was such a seminal, central part of that whole scene that they figured that downtown would just die without him, that there wouldn't be anywhere to go or be anywhere to be seen, and nobody would want to because Warhol was dead. So then in 1988, Micheal Alig parts ways with Rudolph. Rudolph sort of saw this beginning of these club kids, and he appreciated that they were coming into the club and that they were spending money, but he also saw that they were all very youthful, that they were a little bit, you know, like the youths are, kind of narcissistic, and he kind of saw it going down a bad way, and he decided he didn't really want to fill his clubs with club kids and have that be the central part of his business. Micheal starts working for a man named Peter Gatien. Peter Gatien would also be known as a king of sorts, the king of clubs in New York City or something. I can't remember the exact moniker that they gave him, but he owned a lot of clubs. And so Micheal started working for him, and Peter really becomes a mentor to Micheal. This cat looks like a Bond villain. He, you know, would wear like, well, the sort of beige trench coat thing was very big in the late 80s. He always wore an eye patch, and this was not a costume. He very sadly lost an eye in his childhood, so he always had this eye patch. But he's always like walking around like in a trench coat and an eye patch, looking very, like I said, like a Bond villain. He owned a ton of clubs, including one called The Tunnel, which was actually a major starting point for a lot of East Coast rappers. Like Biggie Smalls performed there, but Micheal started throwing parties at The Tunnel, I believe in the basement. And a lot of these parties were like themed parties, and they'd be, I don't know, the theme would be like the color green, or like the king and queen of New York, and all of this. And people would dress wild, and he would fill up the basement of this club with these kids that were sort of increasingly becoming a little almost cult-like following for Micheal. And he also, when they didn't have enough people to fill the party, he would throw these outlaw parties, is what they called them. And he would like get everybody on a city bus or in a McDonald's, or he would break into an abandoned lot and they would just like party there until the cops showed up, and then they'd all run away. And sometimes a few of them would get arrested, but if they did, it was just like a nuisance charge or like trespassing. So it was like not really that big of a deal, and usually they'd let him go. Working with Peter Gatien and throwing these parties is where Micheal really gets his coronation, if you will, as the king of the club kids. This is where people really start to know who he is. He's an influencer, basically. I mean, they didn't have the internet back then, but that's what he was doing. He was influencing people, and he sort of started to build this brand, this lifestyle around this party scene. He just really came into himself here, and under the guide of Peter Gatien, who he considered to be like a father figure to him. Peter Gatien's basically financing his entire lifestyle, not just by paying him through the club, but also, you know, he's helping him pay for things like an apartment and stuff like that, because Micheal is bringing people into the club. He's bringing money in and making Peter a lot of cash, and helping to make Peter's clubs known throughout New York City as a place to be. At some point, Peter Gatien had opened up a club called the Limelight, and the Limelight is infamous in New York City club history. The Limelight is the place where the whole club kids movement would really come to full bloom. And here, the activities happening within the club would lead to a DEA investigation that would eventually completely ruin Peter and also see him deported back to Canada. The Limelight would also become forever tainted by its association with Micheal Alig. So this club, it was unique. It stood out. It was built in an old Gothic style cathedral in 1844. It was owned by the church until the 70s when it was deconsecrated, and it was sold to, get this, a drug rehab program, which would end up being very ironic. And it's sort of a poetic backdrop for what would go on there when Micheal was in charge of the parties. You had go-go dancers on the altar, which was still in place. Millions of dollars in money exchanging hands on a weekly basis. There was booze, there was drugs, there was sex. It was the absolutely profane juxtaposed against the sacred, because it still looked like a church inside. I mean, they basically just took out the pews. So I'm sure it was really incredible to see. I would have liked to see it in its heyday. I bet it was amazing. These clubs, what they would do is they would have like weekly parties, right? Most clubs as it was then, did the majority of their business on like Friday and Saturday nights, right? That's when most everybody's off of work, etc., etc. Well, these club kids, I mean, most of them were young. A lot of them lived with their parents. They didn't have jobs, you know, and also celebrities can go out any day of the week. So Micheal started throwing this weekly party, and the party was called Disco 2000. And the club would see Micheal Alig's Wednesday night party as their busiest night of the week. They brought in more money on Wednesday night than they did on like Friday and Saturday combined. That's quite a feat. Really kind of amazing. And during the Disco 2000 parties, the boundaries were pushed to an insane degree. These kids' costumes got wilder and wilder. It wasn't just polka dots on the face anymore. It was full-on costumes. And the scene, by this point, had completely moved away from the artsy live music film. It was looking like a rave. But, you know, all kinds of crazy stuff went on. They would have a hot body contest where people would get like fully nude. Like, you could never get away with this stuff anymore. They had a guy who drank pee, and that was his whole thing, is he would just get up on stage and drink pee. And in the meantime, you know, Micheal, who's just always looking for attention and trying to have the spotlight on him, his behavior gets wilder and wilder too. But people just tolerate it. Like, he would pee on people. That's one thing he was really well known for, was just like peeing on people. And people just kind of laughed it off. They're like, oh, it's just Micheal. Don't worry about it. I'm not trying to go to a party and get peed on, but you know, maybe that's just me. At this time, the club kids, Micheal Alig, his core group, so Micheal Alig, James St. James, RuPaul. RuPaul was a club kid, and actually a lot of his first drag queen gigs were at Micheal's parties. They had other weird names, Wallpaper, Jenny Talia, anyway, they start making their way around the talk show circuit. So they're traveling all over the country. They're on Jenny Jones, they're on Ricky Lake, they're on Geraldo. And over the years, they made several appearances on these shows to sort of just talk about their lifestyle and to promote it. This was a business to them, especially to Micheal. No one more so than Micheal. He was looking to build a brand, build a lifestyle, and to make money off of this. It wasn't just about having a good time. He wasn't just some dumb kid trying to party. He was a businessman by this point, and he was looking to sell his lifestyle to turn a profit. However, all that glitters is not gold, and unfortunately, drugs, substance use, was a pervasive part of this scene. And you know, really, when you're talking about clubbing and party scenes and wealthy people, even, you know, you look at LA today, we all know that drugs are a part of that. Cocaine obviously had been a very popular party drug for decades at this point. Along with rave kind of thing came ecstasy. And that was a very, very popular thing to use among the clubbers, the club kids, etc. Ecstasy was all over the place. And another drug, very unique to the club kids and very unique to this point in time and to this scene, was a drug called ketamine, which they most often referred to as Special K. And it was not a breakfast cereal. It was an animal tranquilizer. I don't understand what the appeal is, but this was a big thing. They loved this stuff, especially James St. James. Ketamine was his drug of choice. That's what he would do above anything else. Now, when this whole thing first started, Micheal had been very against drugs. In fact, James St. James would later say that when he would find them like locked away in the bathroom, doing these substances, he would like grab them and snatch them out of their hands and flush them down the toilet. But, you know, slowly, he started to do a little ecstasy. He started to bump a little coke. Things progressed as they so often and sadly do. And also at this time, the party time drug cocaine that was so popular in the 80s had given way to the crack epidemic of the 90s. Crack was cheaper, it was more potent, and therefore way more addictive. And it was becoming a really major problem in the big cities throughout the entire country. I think that it would be very much analogous to the opioid epidemic that we are experiencing now. It was kind of a dark time. And For Micheal, he really started getting in deeply. He wasn't just doing a little coke and a little ecstasy. He was doing Special K, and he had especially gotten himself into heroin. I'm so sorry if you can hear my neighbor's dog. Where there's demand, there will be supply. So drug dealers had always been sort of part of the club scene. They were trying to shill their wares where they were wanted. But as Micheal started getting deeper and deeper and deeper into his substance use, he started putting these drug dealers on his payroll. Since he was sort of their boss in a way, it ensured that he would always get them cheap or free, and he would never run out. And at this point, that was very, very important to him. This is where we enter Andre, or Angel, Melendez, and another man named Robert Riggs, who went by Freeze. Now, Freeze had been sort of on the periphery of the group for a long time. He at one time had been a hat maker. He then started sort of designing costumes for some of the local drag queens. Apparently, he was really good at it. He was supposedly very intelligent, was prone to having really deep conversations with people, and he also ended up being a drug dealer. And in the book, Party Monster, or Disco Bloodbath, James sort of credits himself for taking Freeze and turning him into this drug dealer. And, you know, it appealed to Freeze. He wanted the money and he liked the lifestyle, and so he became good at it, and he became one of these dealers that was on the payroll for Micheal Alig. The story is very, very similar for Angel Melendez. He had been dealing in several of Peter Gatien's clubs. I don't really know if Peter had him on the payroll or what the situation was, but he ended up cozying up to Micheal, and apparently they were friends. This is a little bit contested. It may just be that, you know, Angel knew that this was where the money was at, so he wanted to be around the club kids. But he was called Angel because he had a habit of wearing very large angel wings all the time. So he sort of had a leather daddy kind of look often. He would have like bondage straps or like all leather, and then these big wings, so it made him really easy to spot. And Angel, as we know, would eventually become our victim, and Robert Freeze Riggs would become Micheal Alig's accomplice, and we're going to discuss that more in depth in part 2. In 1996, 12 years after Micheal had arrived in New York City, things were not going great. This year, Micheal would throw probably his most famous party, which was the Blood Feast party. This would later be pointed to as evidence for premeditation for the killing of Angel Melendez, but it was very gore-based. The flyers that were sent out for this showed Micheal consuming human flesh. When you walked in, everything was covered in blood. There was body parts. It was all about dismemberment and gore. The Blood Feast party was based on a movie from 1962 that Micheal Alig had watched with his mother, where a man kills a woman and dismembers her body in a bathtub. I personally, this is my opinion, I don't really think that his throwing this party had anything to do with wanting to kill anybody or premeditation in any way. I think that he was a macabre person. People would later go on and say, well, he just always was obsessed with death and he just really loved horror and gore. And I'm like, okay, well, same. All right, but that doesn't mean I'm going to kill anybody. He just, you know, these were things he was interested in. Again, we can debate this a little more in part 2, but I don't think that this pointed to any kind of premeditation on his part. He also threw an emergency room party, which was interesting. The whole theme was like people were overdosing, and it was weird stuff. It had started to get a little darker. You know, I guess that's the point, really, is that the themes of these parties had started to get a little darker, but Micheal had also started getting more and more and more and more involved in his addiction. And he was an addict. He had tried to go to rehab twice at this point. He had relapsed after rehab twice at this point. A lot of people were already pulling away from him. A lot of people who did not get sucked into drug use, and many of whom went on to be very successful later on. A lot of these people are still alive. They're still active and doing things. Not all of them are in entertainment anymore. Some of them are, and they're fine. But even James, who was his best frenemy, wasn't around as much anymore, even though James was dealing with plenty of addiction problems of his own. He still had even been like, whoa, Mary, slow down. It seems like most of the people who were still around were around because Micheal still had access to drugs. He still had access to the dealers. He still had access to money, mostly still from Peter Gatien. And I think that that's what mostly tied him to anybody who he was closely associating with at this time. Much like the Flower Children in San Francisco in the 60s and 70s, but it started over a decade before as a group of young kids looking for fun and freedom of expression, looking for a place where they could be themselves, you know, not be judged by a society that they felt outcast from, had taken a much darker turn. It had become more about drug use than anything else, about pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable to society to a point of absolute destruction. The culture of extremity and excess the club kids had built was collapsing, and in the middle of it all was Micheal, who was no longer the spirited, carefree, determined 18-year-old that had arrived in 1984. He was now nearly 30, strung out, and desperately trying to hold on to his crown in a world that was crumbling all around him. The limelight was very much on its way out. It was a little confusing for the timeline, but it seems by 1996, the limelight had actually already been padlocked. I don't know if it reopened maybe for a time, because I know Micheal did throw some parties, but Peter Gatien was embroiled in a DEA investigation involving the drugs that were being sold in his clubs. They kind of wanted to get him as like a kingpin. Micheal was about to be unemployed and unemployable, and the financial support that had been provided by Peter Gatien was drying up. He just didn't have it anymore. His clubs were mostly closed, and he was, involved in this investigation. Peter wasn't paying for his apartment and paying for his drugs and paying for his lifestyle anymore. In fact, Micheal had been approached by the DEA and asked to be sort of an informant against Peter Gatien in this investigation they were doing into the drugs in the club. And I think that this really gives some insight into Micheal's personality. Peter was a man who he considered a father. This was a man who was his mentor, who had given him the space to create this world that he wanted so badly, to become known all over New York and really all over the nation. Remember, they had been traveling everywhere, going on these talk shows and opening clubs too. He was highly, highly influential in this style, and Peter had given that to him. And yet he was willing to turn on this man in order to keep himself out of trouble, in order to keep the heat off of him so he could continue to live the lifestyle that he wanted to live, continue to do drugs and whatever. And I really think, personally, this is an opinion, I'm not a professional anything, but I really think that this speaks to a lot of narcissism on Micheal's part. So by this point, Micheal and Freeze were living together in an apartment, and Angel was living there as well. And Micheal constantly had access to the drugs. They would do all of Angel's drugs. And it seemed like sometimes Angel didn't mind. And I imagine that Angel didn't mind because Peter Gatien would pay him any of Michael's drug debt. But that was starting to dry up. Like I said, Alig didn't have any money. He was about to get evicted from his apartment because he couldn't pay the rent or the mortgage or whatever he had. And he certainly couldn't pay his drug debt to Angel. Around March of 1996, a few people start noticing that Angel's gone. And then more people start noticing that Angel's gone. Now, that's not that unusual. He is a drug dealer, but slowly they begin to realize he didn't get picked up by the cops. He didn't move away. And rumors start to circulate that Angel has been murdered and that Micheal Alig and Robert Freeze Riggs had something to do with it. And that's where I'm going to end part 1. I hope you will join me for part 2 in a few days. Hi, hello. This is really embarrassing, but I was editing the footage for this video and I realized that my battery on my camera died before I really got to fully say goodbye to you guys. Thank you so much for being here with me, and please take some time to take care of yourself today. I will see you next time. Bye. I'm gonna set your place on fire. Let's get higher. I'm gonna set your place on fire. Let's get higher. I'ma make it burn. I'ma